I had never heard the term Skinwalker before I arrived in New Mexico. I was sent there for work, and I stayed there for 2 months before heading back to Nebraska for a new assignment. I mostly kept to myself, never really spent time around the area. Occasionally I would hear my coworkers complaining about noises that kept them up at night. I didn't care much for scary stories, and I didn't care about what was outside, as long as it wasn't messing with my sleep. The men seemed to enjoy the creepy stories from the locals, and would kill time talking about what they had heard that day. At first it was all fun. The men would talk about paranormal sightings. Not having lived through anything like that made it intriguing. However, it wasn't until one of them didn't show up for work that made the rest of them start taking the stories a little more seriously. The man was found hiding in his trailer. I didn't see him personally, but the team was told that he was sent to a nearby hospital. One of the men that found him told us that he was huddled up in a small corner mumbling to himself over and over. "Hooves. Eyes. It laughed. It laughed at me." I felt bad for the guy. The stress from work was probably getting to him. However, the other men started getting worked up. One night, I made my way to a local bar and found 3 other guys I worked with talking to the bartender about the possibility of something paranormal happening back at camp. The bartender wasn't too happy about the guys bringing up folklore they knew nothing about, and occasionally left to serve the other patrons, trying his best to ignore the 3 of them. One of the men started talking about skinwalkers, while the rest listened closely. They had all had a few drinks in them by this point and were getting pretty loud. Everyone at the bar, including myself, started to look at them, annoyed about how obnoxious they were acting. I was thinking about how stupid the men were looking when I noticed an older man dressed in farmer's attire, who appeared to be Native American, was listening in on the conversation. The man looked angry and approached the group very slowly before standing behind them, not saying a word. One of the men from my team looked at him and asked him what he wanted. The old man did not respond and just stared at him. I stood up from my table hoping that none of the drunks from my team would be dumb enough to start a fight with the old man. He just stood there and stared blankly as the men started taunting him. Eventually, the 3 of them got bored and turned their backs on him. It was when the subject of skinwalkers came up again, as when the old man finally spoke.
"Stop talking about something you know nothing about."
The men turned around and stood up. I moved in closer in the hopes that they would see me and back off. The old man stood his ground and told them not to be disrespectful and not to meddle in things that were beyond their understanding. The men got irritated, and right as one of them took a step towards the old man, I finally intervened. Being somewhat their superior, the 3 of them finally left the bar, shaking their heads. I turned and apologized to the old man, and said that they were just a bunch of immature kids that didn't know how to handle their alcohol. That's when the old man warned me to be careful. He said that the locals didn't talk about that subject, and that acknowledging it would only bring unwanted attention. Not wanting to be rude, I simply nodded and told the old man that I would keep an eye out on my team. I returned to camp and saw one of the men from the bar asleep on a chair in front of his trailer holding a beer. I didn't really care to wake him up. His drunk ass can sleep outside, and without giving it another thought, I went straight to bed. It must have been around 3 in the morning when I woke up to the sound of men outside yelling. I got up and walked out, still half asleep, and I saw that my coworkers were crowded around something. I walked up to see what the commotion was all about, and was overwhelmed by the coppery stench of fresh blood and the sight of a dead man with his throat slashed. It was one of my coworkers from the bar, the one who I had seen passed out outside of his trailer just hours prior. Apparently the man had taken his own life with a shard from a broken bottle. I had to walk away because I was feeling sick to my stomach. I made my way up a small path and eventually vomited. When I was finished, I was about to walk back when I heard something behind me. When I turned around, the darkness did not allow for me to get a good look at what was up ahead. but I was able to make out the figure of someone standing not too far from me. I thought it was perhaps one of the other men who had to excuse himself from the gruesome sight. However, this person was moving strangely. I called out for the man to identify himself. However, I heard no immediate response. The person was walking closer, very slowly, and jerking movements. It looked like a child learning how to walk. I called out once again for the person to identify themselves. Its body was twitching, which really frightened me. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest, on the verge of total panic. It wasn't until he came closer, and the moonlight hit his face, that I realized that this thing was not human. The body was a mesh of what had been Carl, the man who I had just seen dead moments ago. However, the skin looked contorted and stretched out, as if it were being worn as a mask. Its legs looked awkward and unnatural, and that's when I noticed a pair of hooves. I ran out of there as fast as I could. I glanced back in the hopes that it wasn't following me, but I no longer saw the strange figure in the moonlight. Everyone was so focused on the body that no one noticed me running back into my trailer. The cops were already on their way because of Carl's death. I sat in my trailer not knowing what to think, say, or do. I waited for the sheriff to arrive before going back out. A huge lawsuit was filed against our company for not completing the job. However, no one would go back to work after what happened to Carl. There were also a few more reported sightings of a strange animal lurking outside the campsite at night. I was one of the first men who was packed up and ready to go. I visited the local bar one last time in the hopes of finding that old man that I had spoken to before. He was in the same spot he had been, drinking. Before I could even get a word out, he spoke.
I warned them. You can't go around talking about stuff like that and not expect anything to happen.
I then asked, did he really take his own life? Or was it? The old man put down his drink and looked at me dead in the eyes.
Don't speak of them. You'll only attract attention to yourself.
The old man then got up and left without saying another word. Growing up, my parents didn't let me watch cartoons because they would, quote, ruin my brain. Instead, I found myself watching a lot of shows about monsters, aliens, or other things paranormal. I remember many nights where I was too scared to go to bed because I had just watched one of those programs. I live in a pretty heavily forested area. I do have a decent amount of neighbors. However, everything behind my house is nothing but thick forest. When night falls, the darkness consumes my entire neighborhood, which is rather small. Whenever I would take out the trash at night, or come home from work around 2 a.m., I would sprint to the front door and turn around, looking out for whatever may be lurking in the darkness as I unlocked the door and quickly slid inside. Even though I've been through grade school and am in my final years of college, I still imagine those hideous monsters I saw on TV chasing me down and killing me if I don't get away fast enough. I don't think I'll ever get out of this jumpy stage in my life. Of course I wouldn't. Not after that night, that experience with that thing. About 3 years ago, some relatives from Europe came to visit some family members I had in Vermont. At the time, my parents chose to drive up to Vermont to attend the gathering, since it had been almost 15 years since our last visit, leaving me to drive up on my own the next day after my classes ended, since it was spring break. After coming home to pack for the visit, I hopped in my car and put the address into my GPS. At first it told me it would be a 6-hour drive, but when I hit the button it notified me that there was heavy traffic due to some construction work. That 6 hours grew to 8.5 hours. Great. This was going to be a fun drive, much longer than I remember as a 7-year-old. I left at a decent hour, and by that I mean it was around 8 o'clock at night. Hopefully I would avoid some of that construction work that was causing the heavy traffic, About an hour in, I stopped for some snacks and soda at a BJ's convenience store, and I also filled up my tank while I was there. By this point, I was feeling pretty good about my drive, thinking, an hour just went by so fast. What's another 7? Finally, I was on I-91, and after almost 3 hours of driving, I was at the part where it would slow down, as this area of the highway was under construction for what looked like several miles according to my GPS. Although there was no construction being done at this hour except for a few diggers on the shoulder, the road patterns were still constricted by traffic cones, and a cop that pulled somebody over right in the middle of the road. From what I can remember, as I was nearing Greenfield, Massachusetts, my GPS told me that there was another way that would be faster. I just needed to get off at the next exit and follow some smaller state roads to the west for a few dozen miles or so. This would shave off a couple of hours of slow driving, which is one of my pet peeves. When I got off the exit, I was delighted to see an open, yet curvy road ahead of me. It was nearing 1 o'clock in the morning, and I began thinking of ways to go inside my relative's house at such a late hour without disturbing them. For the first hour and a half, it was mostly uneventful. So I'll cut to the part that will haunt me for years, possibly for the rest of my life. I was approaching a town called Dover in Vermont. For some reason it sounded familiar to me. I don't remember why though. I checked my GPS and saw that I only had 90 miles to go. This was good news to distract me from the fact that I had made a wrong turn at some point and ended up being on this bumpy ass back road. This is where I knew something serious could happen to me, and nobody would be around to help. My eyes widened as I noticed that my GPS signal was lost. Perfect. Now I was in the middle of nowhere, with no GPS. I pulled over and tried to think of the last few turns I had made so that I could backtrack to the main road. Now that it was after 2 a.m. and about 20 degrees outside, I quickly got a cold feeling in my chest, almost like the area around me was filled with demons and monsters. I tried to shrug it off, but I just couldn't. I suddenly felt a burning in my bladder, and it was at that point that I realized that I had to take an epic piss. I quickly made my situation a lot worse as I mistakenly turned off my car in this cold weather. As I took care of business, I kept my back against the side of my car, out of fear of something grabbing me from behind, something that has always sat with me as one of my biggest fears. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I quickly picked up on a foul stench in the air. It was like death itself was living in these woods. As I finished up, I caught a glimpse of something that I had not noticed before. Several of the trees had long scratch marks in them, and I don't mean like the type of scratch marks that 2 teenagers make when they're carving their names into them. These were deep, heavy gashes. I quickly realized that it was time to get the hell out of there. I felt the darkness closing in on my car as I got inside. I turned the keys in the ignition about 4 times, until my old car finally turned over. It was a mistake to turn it off. I rejoiced in the fact that my car magically started, despite being 20 years old. However, that quick feeling of bliss disappeared. As soon as I remembered, I was still in the middle of nowhere, with no cell phone reception. I made a U-turn, catching another glimpse of the gashes on the trees. My headlights caught something moving in the distance among the trees. I stopped the car so I could get a better look. Was it a person? I thought to myself what I should do in this situation. Should I help them? Or were they here to rob me or steal my car? When the figure walked into the light, I could tell that it was in fact a man. When the figure came within about 30 feet of my car, I rolled down my window and was about to question him when he shouted at me, "Run! There's something evil in these woods. Don't worry about me. Just get the hell out of here." The person came within the rays of my headlights, and I caught a glimpse of his body. My heart jumped into my throat as I saw that his left arm had been ripped off, and he was bleeding profusely. At that moment, I knew that it was time to go. The thought crossed my mind that this was some kind of sick prank, but as the man got closer, I could see that he was really bleeding and suffering. My mind then went on autopilot, and I floored it out of there. the man's words echoing in my head. I felt bad for leaving him there. What could I have done for him anyways? I was pushing about 90 miles per hour in my car, but time itself felt like it was moving slowly, as all the dark and evil creatures from my memories flashed in my head. Was it one of those things that I had seen on TV? Just then, I remembered why Dover sounded so familiar to me. The story of the Dover demon from the 1970s or 1980s, when a college student saw some kind of humanoid figure walking by the side of the road. I got nervous now. I was in this creature's territory, and it was not happy, seeing what happened to that man. Was this really happening to me? I quickly raced back the way I came. I stopped at the intersection before turning back on the road. I looked both ways, first left, then right, and that's when I saw it. My entire body felt limp and my heart stopped. I shouted as I saw something staring back at me through the window. It was pale and hunched over. I could see a deep indentation within its ribcage, where a normal person's solar plexus would be, but the worst part was its face. I felt like I was looking at something straight out of hell. Its head did not have a single hair on it. It had protruding temple bones and deep eye sockets, filled with something that I wouldn't even call eyes. Whatever they were black and soulless. There were two small holes in place of a nose, and perhaps the most menacing feature was its mouth, with its low-hanging lips and its sharp, jagged teeth that looked like a row of kitchen knives. I am able to describe all of this because in the instant that I saw its disgusting face, it was forever burned into my mind. I spared no time and pressed my gas pedal down to the floor. My car burned rubber and then began to accelerate down the road. I must have ran over its foot because it let out one of the most disgusting and blood-curdling screeches I've ever heard in my life. I think I may have actually shit my pants when I heard that sound. It sounded like a mixture of a psych ward patient and a horse being shot in the chest with an arrow. Now the chase was on. The creature began to run after my car. I gradually approached top speeds, but the thing kept gaining ground on me. If I had not been in that situation, I think I would have been impressed by the creature's ability to run so fast. The road was curvy, and I had to slow down to avoid crashing. I knew that it would be game over if I wrecked. This thing could easily rip me to shreds and leave no trace on my body within seconds. The reduced speed allowed the creature to keep pace with me. I then came to a fork in the road. I took the right lane and accelerated. The road straightened out as I went over a bridge, and then I picked up even more speed, edging to about 110 miles per hour. I gazed into my rearview mirror and saw something that made this situation even more disturbing. In the distance, I saw 5 more figures come out from under the bridge. They then joined the first one, as they all sprinted towards my car. A morbid thought entered my mind. I would take my own life with a knife in the glove compartment, rather than be a victim of these hideous creatures. I wouldn't get the chance to say goodbye to my parents or relatives. The contorted bodies in my rearview mirror were gaining on me. I could even hear them shouting and wailing in unison. As I leaned over to get the knife out of my glove box, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. It was a sign to get back onto Interstate 91. This was my salvation. I had a chance to lose these creatures on the highway. I yanked my steering wheel, nearly wrecking my car getting back onto the ramp to I-95. I sped up the ramp and made an illegal left turn, going down the highway the wrong way for about 500 feet before turning back around. At this hour, there was barely anybody on the road. These demented creatures entered the highway the same way I did, but they ended up chasing another car instead. The driver of that car must have noticed these things chasing him, as I heard his loud exhaust rattle as his car disappeared down the highway. He seemed to have a much faster car than I did. The vehicle managed to outrun the creatures, and I observed from a distance as they dipped back into the woods on the side of the highway and were finally out of sight. I was able to get a signal back on my phone, and I was relieved to see that I was only 30 miles out from my destination. I cautiously drove the rest of the way, checking my mirrors every 5 minutes. Luckily, when I got to my relative's house, they had left the garage door open for me. I briskly pulled my car in and shut the door behind me. I was shaking, and I felt sick. I eventually calmed myself down and looked over at a clock that was mounted on the garage wall. It was 3:52 a.m. I figured that it was time to get some sleep. And I wish I could tell you that my nightmarish tale ended there, but unfortunately it does not. For the rest of my visit, I enjoyed several activities with my family, and I nearly forgot about the hellish experience I went through on my way up there. However, on the morning of the day of my last visit, I woke up super early, around 7 a.m. I had a little bit of a hangover from drinking all night with my uncles. I got the sudden urge to buy my relatives from Europe a cheesy parting gift, as it was possible that it would be another 10 to 15 years before I saw them again. I mustered up the strength to get up and get dressed and drive to the local Walmart. I parked in a spot by the side of the store. I quickly went inside and bought some cheesy cards and some other small items to give to my family members. As I rounded the corner to get back to my car, my heart once again fell into my stomach, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Beyond the parking lot was a tree line, and I found myself staring at the man with the missing arm. He called out to me, "They're coming for you!" All sorts of alarms went off in my head. How did he find me here? Or better yet, how is he still alive? What was he? I panicked and ran back into the store. I waited inside for nearly 45 minutes before coming out again. This time, the coast was clear, and I safely made it back to my relative's house, just in time for brunch. That evening we all said our goodbyes. I then hopped in my car and followed my parents back to our house in New Jersey, making sure we stayed on I-91, not taking any back roads. When I got back, I did some research about my encounter and learned what I saw that night were creatures known as Skinwalkers. I also found out that they can shapeshift into human forms to play tricks on people and lure them to their doom. This revelation made me feel nauseous. Time passed without any further incidents. The next year I got accepted into a medical school in Boston, and I was delighted to spend the next few years of my life in an urban area, away from any threats lurking in the night. However, I am still extremely nervous driving at night, and I'm also wary of strangers that I see on my travels. I'll end this by saying please be careful driving around isolated areas at night. You never know what you might encounter. There's always a reason to be afraid.